Thank you so much, Cody, for the opportunity to present here at the String Phenomenology Seminar Series about this correspondence that I have worked on with Jim Halverson and Keegan Stoner based on this paper. We have established a correspondence between neural networks and quantum field theory. So we would talk about what the correspondence means for both asymptotically wide neural networks and also finite weight practical neural networks. And we will show in order to construct a meaningful correspondence, we need to have all the essentials of modern day quantum field theory, such as Wilsonian EFT and renormalization. A basic question, why do we care about neural networks? Neural networks are the backbones of modern day deep learning, such as supervised learning, where it works as a very powerful function that learns from training over a set of inputs and it can predict outputs. There are also generative models where it basically learns to construct a map that draws from noise distribution to draws from actual data distribution. In other words, it learns to generate a simulated fit data. This has become very important in physics applications, including string theory. Here are some references that can be checked. Also, reinforcement learning is one of the prime examples of why neural networks work, where neural networks work so well. We all know about AlphaZero, where a machine has beat humans in chess. Here it learns to pick intelligent step-dependent actions. The essentials of training of neural networks is every time we train a neural network, we get a different result. So the trained neural networks all draw from some distribution. And the natural question is, what is that distribution when the weight goes to infinity? And where does quantum field theory comes in the picture to describe that distribution? We are going to show that something that is so crucial part of modern day artificial intelligence agents can be really well described using a fundamental feature of fundamental physics such as quantum field theory. And it can also help us solve the famous overparameterization problem in neural networks and machine learning. Here is the outline of the talk. First, we are going to talk about what is neural networks of our interest here, and then what are asymptotic neural networks and how free field theory can describe them. Then we go over to practical neural networks, which are of finite weight, and we can show that quantum field theory even works well there. Finally, to show that this correspondence works, we need to incorporate Wilsonian renormalization group flow, and we show that neural network experiments support that. Firstly, what are neural networks? Broadly speaking, neural networks are functions that map from an input space to an output space. It has continuous learnable parameters theta that gets updated by different training mechanisms such as supervised learning, generative models, reinforcement learning. And there are also discrete hyperparameters such as n. N is the weight. In general, it can be visualized as a cluster of nodes, computational nodes that pass information along the edges. Of course, the picture of the brain is denoting it is inspired by human brain and other brains. This is a schematic diagram of a fully connected network. The first layer is the input and the final layer is the output, and there are many layers which are called hidden layers. As information passes from the input layer to the output layer, the direction is referred to as depth. Each hidden layer has n number of units. These units are nodes, computational nodes, and n is called the weight. A fully connected network refers to a network where each of the hidden layers and all the layers are connected. Each of the nodes are connected to all the nodes on the adjacent layers on both sides. Mathematically, we can represent a fully connected network as this. X is the input, it is a vector. Xj is called the post-activation. W is called weights, B is called biases. Together, W and B form the learnable hyperparameters theta. Z is called the pre-activation. Sigma is the nonlinear function, nonlinear activation function. It's a crucial part of the hidden layers. If we take the hyperparameter n to infinity, where the number of nodes in hidden layers become infinitely large, then the output is basically a sum over n independently and identically distributed random numbers. And central limit theorem says such an output is drawn from a Gaussian distribution. Here, the neural network itself is said to follow a Gaussian process. It is shown in these references that any standard neural network architecture admits this Gaussian process limit when the weight goes to infinity. Examples are here: single layer infinite width feed-forward networks, deep infinite width feed-forward networks, infinite channel NNs, and there are many other examples here. Also, under proper training, this GP property persists also, although the Gaussian distribution itself changes under training. We are going to focus for experimental reasons on the infinite width single layer feed-forward network. This is the architecture in schematics, and this is the output function, how it relates to the weights and biases of the different layers. Weights and biases are chosen from these Gaussian distributions. The first layer and the last layer in the single width, infinite width single layer feed-forward networks are linear layer. This layer is the hidden layer, and this is only one hidden layer with a nonlinear activation sigma. Now, if infinite width neural networks are going to follow Gaussian processes, a natural thing came to our mind that we have free field theory, which is a really nice description of a general Gaussian process. The probability distribution function for a Gaussian process has this generating functional, which is very similar to the free field theory generating functional. Inspired by that, we made a log likelihood for the Gaussian process describing the neural network in the infinite width limit. If we can define the log likelihood, then inspired by quantum field theory, we can also calculate the endpoint correlation functions in the neural network side. We built up a dictionary between asymptotically wide neural networks and free quantum field theories. The inputs of the neural network are equivalent to the external space or space-time points in the quantum field theory side. All the inputs in neural network has the same leveling. So it is equivalent to external space points in the field theory side. So we have to deal with Euclidean field theory here. The kernels of the neural network, which is the covariance, is equivalent to the Feynman propagator, as can be seen in this relation. And the output of the neural network is equivalent to the free field. Log likelihood is equivalent to the free action of the field theory. Using this, we are going to analytically and using Feynman diagrams represent the theoretical expressions for the endpoint functions for the asymptotically wide neural network. The 2-point and 4-point functions are given in terms of the Feynman diagrams. We want to ask if the experiments on the neural network side in the infinite width limit or very large width limit are going to support this or not. If they support, that indicates that in the infinite width limit, quantum field theory is a good description of a neural network. We are choosing mean-free Gaussian processes here because mean-free GPs will have all the odd point functions going to 0, and all the even point functions can be written entirely in terms of the 2-point function, which is the kernel. So on the experimental side, we would have all the even point functions from a very high weight neural network. And on the theoretical side, we have the endpoint functions, even endpoint functions predicted entirely in terms of the kernel functions of that architecture. We define the endpoint deviations, which is the deviation between the experimental endpoint function, experimental from the neural network side, and the theoretical predicted version from the quantum field theory side. And we are going to test it for 2-point, 4-point, and 6-point functions using neural network architectures. These are the 3 architectures we are going to focus on. Erf and ReLU activations are very famous in neural network community. These are the kernels. We also concoct a new architecture called Gaussian, which is taken from the exponential activation and then adding a layer of renormalization. This gives an interesting translationally invariant kernel. This will become very interesting later on. We restrict our experiments to this set of inputs. These are chosen to reduce the statistical noise. Sigma b square and sigma w square are the covariance of the distributions that w and b parameters are chosen from. For ReLU-net, we set sigma b square equals 0 because we want a homogeneous scaling of the ReLU kernel later on. These are the weights that we run our experiments on. There are 10 sets of experiments with 10 to the power 6 neural nets each. Here are the endpoint deviations normalized by the GP predicted endpoint function by field theory. The blue line is the actual endpoint deviation data measure. The experimental endpoint functions are the ensembled averages over the 10 sets of experiments. The background, the orange line, is the average of the standard deviation of the measure across the 10 experiments. We can see that the 2-point function in all the 3 cases lies below the background. This is indicating that the 2-point function is exact. The GP kernel is the exact 2-point function at all weights. So the Gaussian process of the 3 architectures we are studying here is not the Gaussian process of the known free field theories, it's some other Gaussian process. Interestingly, for the 4-point and 6-point function, we see a 1/n fall-off as predicted by field theory. A natural question, we have seen that the asymptotically wide neural networks can be described using free field theories, but asymptotically wide neural networks are not practical. We deal with finite bit neural networks. Can they be described using quantum field theory or any fundamental physics prescription? The answer is yes, because we have already seen that the correlation functions for n more than 2 are receiving 1/n suppressed corrections. So we are going to check if by perturbative field theory, by turning on interactions, we can provide a nice description for finite bit neural networks or not. Finite bit neural networks that admit a GP limit as n goes to infinity should be able to be described by a non-Gaussian process corresponding to an EFT. The correction to the Gaussian action is given by this. Fx are the outputs. Point to be kept in mind, in general, Fx can be vectors. They don't necessarily have to be scalars. The coefficients of these correction terms are equivalent to the coupling strengths. We built up a dictionary between the finite neural network and the interacting quantum field theory. Everything else is same as before, but now the output is equivalent to an interacting field. We are going to use the rules from Wilsonian EFT and say that we would look at the architecture and we would determine the highest operator that we want in the correction term to the GP action, and we would experimentally verify if that action or log likelihood can describe the finite bit neural network or not. Since we have chosen mean-free GP, our odd point functions already vanish experimentally, indicating that all the odd couplings here are going to vanish. So we are only left with even order correction terms. We further want to test the Wilsonian notion that whether here kappa is more irrelevant to lambda or not. So for theoretical predictions, we are going to assume the Wilsonian sense kappa is more irrelevant to lambda and predict results experimentally. If those results agree, then we can say that yes, EFT is working. Interesting point to note, more parameters in the neural network, which is flowing towards the GP, means fewer in the effective field theory because of the irrelevance of the operators in the Wilsonian sense. We predict the endpoint function at order lambda and order kappa corrections, and we set up a new set of Feynman rules for the interacting field theory describing the finite bit neural networks. Because the 2-point functions are exact at all weights, we have introduced rule 4.5. Because the GPs corresponding to finite bit neural networks and GPs of free field theory are different. Point to be noted, the coupling strengths here can be in general functions. Using technical naturalness by 't Hooft, if the NN architecture has a symmetry in the GP limit, we can claim that the coupling strength is a constant. In this case, we have already seen the Gauss-net kernel, as I pointed, is translationally invariant. So that architecture has couplings which are actually constants, and the other 2 examples have coupling functions. The 2-point, 4-point, and 6-point function of the finite bit neural network is predicted by the field theory to be these. You can see that a really complex expression given in terms of neural network quantities can be really well simplified using Feynman diagram prescription. So we would know that effective field theory is working if by experiments we can find the first leading non-Gaussian correction lambda, and we can use that lambda to predict other experiments, and if experiments, experimental results match with those other predictor results. Using 4-point function here, an experimental 4-point function, we can predict lambda. When lambda is a constant, it has this expression. However, when lambda is a function, it can be represented as a constant part plus some fluctuations. If the fluctuations are small with respect to the mean of lambda, the coupling function, then we can always take an average over the coupling function and get the estimated value of the coupling. our estimated coupling strength. Using that estimated lambda, we are going to predict the 6-point function up to order lambda corrections. Now, if we take the deviation of that 6-point function from the experimental 6-point function, that deviation should just be the order kappa corrections at leading order. And if actually Wilsonian EFT is describing the finite with neural networks, this correction should be really irrelevant. The blue line in these experimental results are the GP 6-point function normalized by the experimental 6-point functions. We can see that that is less than 1 in all the 3 cases. And the orange line is the first order lambda correction to the GP 6-point function. So this quantity is again normalized by the experimental 6-point function, and we can see it is really close to 1, indicating that effective field theory is working to describe finite with neural networks. Important point to note that when we introduced the effective action of the effective field theory, there is the implicit notion of cutoffs. Because the moment we have perturbative corrections to the GP endpoint functions to describe the NGP endpoint functions, we have introduced integrals over a variable in the input space that goes from -infinity to infinity. The kernels have a sigma b squared term, which makes the endpoint functions get tree-level divergences. And in order to get rid of not just tree-level divergences at all level, including tree-level, in order to get rid of those divergences, we need to introduce the cutoff parameters lambda. So basically, a family of effective functions, family of effective actions are all referring to the same set of experimental results for endpoint functions. And the endpoint experimental results, they only depend on the inputs because the outputs are only determined by the inputs. They have nothing to do with the choice of cutoff. This begs the notion of renormalization. We claim that the endpoint functions are independent of the cutoff scale chosen. This is only true when the differences in the chosen cutoff factors are absorbed in the differences of the couplings. In other words, we have running couplings, we have associated beta functions. So we want to theoretically predict what should be the beta functions for the different neural network architectures. And then we want to see if the neural network experiments support those claims or not. Using the invariance of 4-point and 6-point functions, we are going to find beta functions for the 3 different architectures. These functions here are all functions defined in terms of kernels. So the scaling of kernel plays an important role. And the beta functions for ReLU, Erf, and Gaussian look like this. Point to be noted, as we have assumed and proven with 6-point predictions, kappa is more irrelevant with respect to lambda. So we can ignore kappa here, and we are only focusing on the beta function of lambda. Experimentally, we have calculated coupling constant and coupling functions for different cutoff scales, and we see that their plots have a slope that matches the beta function predictions very closely for all the 3 experiments on the 3 different architectures that we have. Lastly, we see there is an interesting effect of the output dimensions on the effective action and the GP action, and also on the coupling functions. In the infinite width limit, if there is d out more than 1, the dimension of the outputs, then the neural network outputs correspond to a free field with d out spaces. And in the finite width neural network case, the output corresponds to an interacting field with d out spaces. So in the infinite width limit case, all the correlation functions has SOD out symmetry because the GP action describing that theory has SOD out symmetry. When we go to the finite width neural network, we are currently investigating whether the SOD out symmetry of the NGP action breaks or into some subgroup or whether it retains. 2-point function is exact at all widths, so 2-point function still has the SOD out symmetry even at finite width neural networks. When we study the RG flow of the dimensionless coupling described here, for all the 3 examples that we have, we see a universal UV fixed point at high cutoffs. This cutoff is independent of the architecture, and we assume that many other architectures also show this. There is also an architecture-specific fixed point in the IR. In case of Gaussian, we have this. We have checked the other 2 examples. Their architectures do not show this. So The Gauss-net with the translationally invariant kernel and a coupling constant is really interesting for these reasons. Further, having diode more than one also helps us to suppress the magnitude of the leading non-Gaussian correction terms. If we write the 4-point function up to order lambda square, it has the output dimension entering the game. And if lambda is extracted at quadratic order from G4, it receives a 1 over D out suppression. So in this way, by increasing the dimension of the outputs in the neural networks, we can manipulate the coupling strengths of the effective field theory describing that. In conclusion, we have built up a correspondence between the backbones of modern-day artificial intelligence agents and quantum field theory on the other side, and we have shown that this works really well. Also, we have shown that as neural networks flow towards GP and gets more and more parameters on the dual side, the non-Gaussian coefficients becomes fewer and fewer in the field theory description. In the Wilsonian EFT, by taking a limit on lambda, we can make some coefficients more irrelevant in comparison to others, thereby decreasing the number of important non-Gaussian parameters even more. This is a really good way around the overparameterization problem. Also, by increasing the dimension of the output space, we can suppress the magnitude of the leading non-Gaussian corrections, coefficients, couplings. We have seen that in our experiments, one single number, lambda, is all that takes to correct the GP correlation functions to NGP correlation functions. Although in flowing from GP to NGP, we are losing an infinite number of neural network parameters. Further, currently we are investigating what is supervised learning, which is just learning of the output, the 1-point function, which for the mean free GP, it will take from 0 to some other trained output. So it is equivalent to a symmetry breaking. Thank you for listening to the talk.
All right, thank you, Anindita, for the very nice talk. Let's all thank Anindita using our clap emoji. Are there any questions? While we wait for other questions, I just want to ask if you're, willing to speculate a bit. This is a really cool correspondence, and I'm wondering, as you include other ingredients of quantum field theory that we know and love, how does this generalize to the neural net side? If you include, do you have any idea what happens when you think about fermions or higher spin in the quantum field theory or anything like this?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, and this is something we have in mind. We are checking if we can have derivative terms in the neural network side. So that's one of the most important things that currently we are doing free field theory, and we are doing effective actions of Wilsonian effective field theories, but we do not have any derivative terms. But if we want to do fermions and other things, then derivatives are firstly very important. Mm-hmm. And if we can do derivatives in the neural network side, the restriction is in the neural network experimental side, how much we can do and how much we cannot do. Then a natural question would be to ask if there can be some supersymmetric field theory corresponding to some neural network architecture.
Yeah, that's a cool question. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much for the question.
Next question is from John.
Hi, yeah, I was a little confused about, neural networks should be very expressive. And you see that there's this universality that happens in the large N limit. Should I think of that expressiveness as being able, as talking about the 1-point functions only, and this universality as only applying to the connected correlation functions? Or I guess I was a little confused about what these correlation functions that you were studying were measuring in the neural network sense.
Yeah, so I did not make it explicit, sorry. These are all the correlation functions of the outputs. So yes, your question is correct that the universality is in terms of the output. When n goes to infinity, it's the output that becomes drawn from a Gaussian distribution always.
But Gaussian about some values that have trained on.
Right. It depends on the architecture and the choice of the distributions that the learnable parameters theta gets drawn from. That determines what should be the mean and the covariance, at least what should be the mean of the output in the asymptotically wide case.
Okay. Thanks.
Our next question is from Craig.
Hi, nice talk. I was just wondering, so so everything in this correspondence seems to be based around Gaussian processes. So that seems on the field theory side to correspond to perturbative processes. Is there something that you expect on the neural network side to correspond to non-perturbative type behaviors on the quantum field theory side?
Thank you. That's a really excellent question. So far, even though we have that possibility in mind, so far we have not found anything.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. Interesting.
Next question is from Alex.
Hi, Anindita. Nice talk. Thanks. I was wondering, because you have this like very suggestive comment, your last bullet point on this slide about the interpretation of what learning is in this framework, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that a little bit, whether there's some kind of dynamical interpretation of what's happening or something.
Thanks for the question. So this is something we are still checking. Currently, I do not have much input on this, sorry. But of course, as we train with different number of trainings, we will flow the output from 0, because it's a mean 0 GP, from 0 to some other values. But if you ask how we are controlling that wave, I don't know yet, sorry. So this might be some explicit symmetry breaking on the field theory side. We might have to add some terms by hand and see how that correlates to the symmetry breaking or the learning on the neural network side.
I see. Cool. Thanks.
Okay, if there are no further questions, let's thank Anindita and both our speakers again for the very nice talks today.